Future-Based is an interdisciplinary philosophy platform. For more information, visit futurebased.org.
We can be pretty confident about the level of sentience of many different types of beings, certainly confident enough to influence our ethics.
Jamie Woodhouse is the initiator of the recasting of this simple but broad ethical philosophy. This worldview is focused on evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So this is the Future-Based podcast from the series Beyond Human Relations with your host Annika van der Borren. In this podcast, the second podcast of the series, I'm going into a conversation with Jamie Woodhouse, who is based in London. Among other things, he's working on ethical investments, effective altruism, and the project we will talk about today, Sentientism. Thank you so much for being here today, Jamie. It's such an honor to have you on our Future-Based podcast.
It's great to be here, and thank you for the wonderful introduction too. So.
Yeah, no problem. I can imagine your schedule is quite busy. There's so much going on with Sentientism today. How are you dealing with all the work and the COVID situation? How is it for you at the moment?
Yeah, it's a strange situation for everybody in London, in the UK. We've had it pretty hard. Personally, with my family, we're so much more lucky than most people. We've got a bit of outside space. Kids are teenagers, so they're pretty robust and can cope with these sort of things. And the way I work, I tend to work remotely and from home anyway. So yeah, really lucky.
So let's maybe start off with explaining to the listeners at home what inspires and fascinates you the most. You are currently seen as the spokesman for Sentientism. Could you explain what Sentientism is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't really want to be the spokesman person for it because it's an idea that I think is deeply important, almost foundational, and we'll come on to why. But it's not mine. I don't own it. There's no organization. There's no real membership. There's no fees. There's no structure. There's no governance. Right? It's just a worldview. It's an idea or a philosophy that I'm very keen to promote and develop and get more people to hear about. But hopefully, over time, more people will be talking about it. So, in simple terms, you've introduced it well already. In 3 words, it's evidence, reason, and compassion. So, if that's one thing people remember from this, those are probably the 3 words to take away. And what it's trying to do is answer the 2 most important questions in philosophy, and some might say life. The first question is, what should we believe in? What's true? What is real? And the second question is, what matters morally? And what should we care about? The first 2 words, evidence and reason, answer the first question. So it says, when we're thinking about what to believe and what is true and what is real, we should use evidence of the reality that we exist in, and we should use our reasoning capabilities to think about what might be true. So that doesn't mean the evidence is ever going to be perfect, and that doesn't mean our reasoning is ever going to be perfect. So our beliefs outside of formal systems like maths should always be probabilistic and provisional. Right? We should never be 100% confident of anything, and we should always be open to new evidence. And we should be comfortable not knowing, and we should be comfortable with uncertainty. But that's, I guess, the first half of sentientism, is that we should believe in a naturalistic way by experiencing reality and forming those, hesitant provisional beliefs. So in that sense, it rejects maybe religious beliefs or supernatural beliefs or revealed beliefs, and says, no, we need to use evidence and reason. So in that way, it's very similar to the way a secular humanist might think, or an atheist might think, or someone who just doesn't believe in supernatural being. So that's the first part, is the naturalistic part. How do we choose what to believe? We use evidence and reason. The second question, what matters morally? The clue is in the name of sentientism. And it says we should care about all beings or all entities that are sentient. And sentient in simple terms is having the capacity to experience things subjectively. So we might call positive experiences flourishing or well-being. We might call negative experiences suffering. And those experiences can be enormously rich and varied. They can go from, basic physical pain to existential angst. They can go from physical pleasures all the way through to feelings of love and emotion and connection. What it says is, when we look out at the world around us, we should use evidence and reason to think about which of the beings and the entities around us are sentient. And if we have decent confidence something is sentient, we should have moral consideration for it. We should have compassion for it. And in practical terms, that means we should see needlessly causing a sentient being to suffer or to die, is seen as a moral negative. Doesn't mean it's sometimes not justified or required, but generally, suffering and death are bad, flourishing and life are good.
Yeah, that's a really, really strong principle, I think. And what makes me curious is how can we decide when something is suffering? As you just said, like there are many differences in how people in the world see suffering or what is morally good or bad.
Yeah.
How can we be sure that from our science we are saying the correct thing?
So we can't be sure, right? That's something I'd be clear about. And that's where the naturalism and the scientific approach ties to the ethics, because we don't need to be sure either. We just need to have a decent level of confidence that something is capable of suffering to grant it moral compassion. So to answer your question more positively, it's quite interesting to think this through personally. So one of the things I'm most confident of is that I am sentient. So it's almost like the Descartesian thing of I think, therefore I am, but this is almost like I experience, therefore I am. It's viscerally what I'm going through moment to moment. So I'm pretty confident I'm sentient, but then it gets more challenging. So then I'll think, well, is Annika sentient? And I don't know, right? I'm not 100% confident you are. I could be a solipsist who thinks that I'm the only sentient conscious being in the universe and everything else is purely an illusion. But I'm pretty confident you are sentient. And the reason for that is really one of inference. So, I can observe you, I can talk to you and watch your behavior. And that gives me some degree of confidence that there is some subjective awareness behind those patterns of behavior and those patterns of interaction. Again, it's not 100% confident, but I'm pretty confident. Another reason I'm quite confident you're sentient is because you've basically got very similar architecture to me, right? So you appear to be a human being. You've come through the same evolutionary history and path as me. It's highly likely you have a nervous system and a brain that, while different from mine, is very, very similar structurally. And I could go further. I could put you in an fMRI scanner, and I could put you through pleasurable and painful experiences or other subjective experiences and watch what the machine tells me about what's going on in your brain. Again, I can develop some increased confidence that the electrical activity and the chemical activity going on in your brain looks similar to what's going on in my brain when I'm feeling these things. So again, I'm never 100% confident, but I'm certainly getting into the high 90%. So once you've looked at the human race and built a level of confidence around the sentience of humans, you can look at other biological species too. And through a similar process of inference, looking at behavior, looking at communication, looking at evolutionary history, but also looking at information processing architecture and function and fMRI scans or whatever it is, you can look for correlates to say, again, we're not 100% sure that, the puppy behind me, called Luna, by the way, I might introduce her later, is sentient. I'm not 100% sure, but I have enough confidence from a scientific, uncertain approach. She is also capable of suffering and flourishing as well. And viscerally, anyone who's got a companion animal or has spent any time with any type of animal really will get a sense of that emotionally and intellectually over and above the science. While we're still uncertain and it's always provisional and there's always more research needed and there's always an openness to new evidence, we can be pretty confident about the level of sentience of many different types of beings, certainly confident enough to influence our ethics. But the current scientific consensus, which also matches to my view, is that humans are sentient. Mammals, birds, reptiles, fish are all sentient. And it also seems that many of the invertebrates, certainly some of the more complex ones like octopi, also seem to be sentient as well. There's more research needed around some of the very, very simple animals, some of the other invertebrates. But some confidence that with the super simple animals, like a sea cucumber, it has no nervous system at all. So I have a high degree of confidence that thing isn't sentient. Then you extend that to plants, rich, intricate communications, amazing behavior. We're always trying to find out more, but it doesn't seem that they have either the evolutionary imperative or the information processing architecture that implies any sort of consciousness or sentience whatsoever. So in simple terms, the current scientific consensus, and people will disagree around the edges, is that rocks, rivers, trees, plants, planets, photons, electrons are not sentient, but many of the non-human animals and human animals with a high degree of confidence seem to be sentient.
Okay, that's very scientific based. I think we should always keep in mind that these machines we work with to find out if an animal or a human has a nervous system, they are always man-made. And sure, it's the only thing we have, but we should always keep in mind that how the machine is programmed is very anthropocentric. We're still dealing with our own thoughts on how someone is feeling or how somebody is feeling.
Yeah, and it's a real risk, and because even the story I told is anthropocentric because I started from my experience, and it's difficult to avoid that in a way because I'm not sure where else I could start from but my own human experience. But part of the point of sentientism is to explicitly reject anthropocentrism and to recognize that sentience has been around long before humans even existed. Millions and millions and millions of years. It evolved as a characteristic of other animals long before humans even arrived on the scene, and it certainly exists in most non-humans today. So it's explicitly trying to break that anthropocentric view, even though logically we sort of start from our personal experience. But it's entirely possible that the types of sentient experience, the ranges of experience that non-humans feel and live could be radically different from what humans experience. So we need to keep deep skepticism and a check on ourselves to make sure we're not imposing, as you say, anthropocentric assumptions on other beings that may be radically different.
Yeah, that's good. We should always be open for new knowledge, but that's, as you say, from the naturalistic worldview. In the Beyond Species podcast with you, I think,
Yes.
I heard that you talked about there are certain degrees in which beings are how sentient and that other beings may be less sentient. What science can we use to be sure of that? Or what science do you use for your vision on this?
So this is another area where I need to draw a distinction between, sentientism and my personal view. And this is true for every sentientist. So sentientism is deliberately super simple. It's some might call it a pluralistic platform or a baseline or a foundation. So all it says is naturalism and have compassion for all sentient beings. It doesn't say anything else. So it's irritatingly neutral on almost every other philosophical question. And this is another one of them. So some sentientists will actually take quite a binary view, and they will say an entity is either sentient or it is not. And if it is sentient, we should give it equal moral consideration to all other sentient beings, regardless of its characteristics. So some sentientists do take that view. It's a sort of radical egalitarian view that says, fine, a chicken may seem simpler than a human, but who are we to judge the quality of their experience? Maybe the pain or the suffering or the joy a chicken feels has just as much moral validity as anybody else's. Personally, and I think most sentientists take a more nuanced view, which sees sentience really as a class of very rich, complex information processing. It's nothing more than that. So in that context, I think there are an enormous range of possible sentient experiences, an enormous range of types of being that can be sentient in very different ways. And that might lead you to a conclusion that, and it does with me, that some of the simpler animals, for example, while they may be sentient, they may not experience the same richness and texture and flavors of sentience. And that may or may not lead you to grade your moral consideration. And for me, it does at least leave that door open, that in the thought experiment where I can only save a human or a chicken from a burning building, I will save the human. Now, part of that is probably just an anthropocentric bias that I can't erase, but part of it is also a genuine sense that, the human has a richer, more powerful range and extent of sentient experiences that actually, in the edge case, are morally valuable. So, but even if you take a more graded approach to sentience, sentientism still insists that even for the most minimally sentient being, you still have to have moral consideration for it. You still have to see harming or killing it needlessly as a moral negative. So that's why, for most sentientists, for me, a logical implication of sentientism is something like veganism or very close to veganism.
Yeah, thank you. I think
a long answer again, sorry.
No problem. No, very good. And I think even the moral compassion for the smallest beings, as you said, a thing we really miss in the world at the moment with so much harm going on.
And we shouldn't be naive, right? Because it's almost impossible to totally avoid harm. So we're not putting out some sort of perfect moral standard here. We're just saying that you have to have moral consideration. You have to have compassion. You have to try.
Maybe kind of be seen as the atheist moral view for how we should be, with other beings in the world, and lose the religion, but still have a moral standard. And maybe. And
that's partly how I came to it. So I was brought up in a very gently religious household, which is quite common in the UK. It's Church of England. It was not a very intrusive religion. And while one of the things that religion does is it puts something as more important, as a higher priority than suffering and death of ordinary people and ordinary beings. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you say, God or a church or the priest is more important than the suffering and experiences of ordinary beings, unfortunately, bad things tend to happen. But what it can be difficult, because culturally, in many different cultures around the world, it's sort of assumed that you need a supernatural basis for your ethics for them to be grounded in any way. So you need some sort of perfect, independent moral judge to say that is good, that is bad, and then you'll be punished or rewarded for eternity after you die. And there's a sort of inbuilt assumption that if you lose that religious structure, then your morality goes too. And that was never convincing for me. So in my teenage years, that's one of the reasons I, as many people do, turned to humanism. But then humanism says we don't need a religious basis for our ethics. Our morality actually evolved, again, way before humans, in kin selection and in tribal behavior and pack behavior and reciprocity. And as humans, we've developed the mental capacity to refine and evaluate that, and to develop our ability to cooperate and to build moral structures around that don't need any supernatural basis whatsoever. So in a way, secular humanism is very similar to sentientism, in that it says, look, all we need is evidence and reason, an uncertain probabilistic understanding of the world, and then we can have compassion universally for all humans, regardless of gender, sex, race, age, disability, the list goes on, right? So humanism rejects all of those human discriminations and says we are all human, our suffering matters, our flourishing matters, our life and our death matters, and that should be the center of our morality. The problem with humanism is in the title, right? It's got the name of one species. And while many humanists, in fact, many more humanists actually, for example, are vegan or vegetarian than in the wider population, many humanists already extend their moral circle beyond humans. And some of the humanist organizations are starting to do that as well, which is very encouraging. Humanism is still almost entirely about humans. So in a way, sentientism just takes that next step and says, we agree on the evidence and reason. We agree we don't need a supernatural basis for our ethics, but our moral circle can't be just drawn around humans. It needs to include every being that's capable of suffering.
What made you go into, okay, we should be compassionate for all sentient beings? Were there specific encounters with animals or certain people that inspired you in this?
Yeah, so my thoughts about I guess the naturalism and the humanism and the atheism were always felt quite separate from my thinking about animal ethics. I went vegetarian, I think I was about 22, 23 years old. It was an odd process because I knew the facts and I knew what my decisions caused, and I knew they were morally unacceptable to me, but I almost deliberately avoided thinking about the implications of that logic. I almost tried not to follow those steps through because I knew where they would lead me, and they would lead me ultimately to trying to give up all animal products, which in our society then and still now feels like it makes you a weirdo, right? It makes you strange, it makes you different, it's sort of almost embarrassing to bring your ethics to the fore, which is sort of shocking, but it's true. And so I just deliberately avoided thinking about it. And then almost, silly, but it's almost in a moment of weakness, I let myself follow the logic through, and then had no real choice to make the personal behavioural changes that came with vegetarianism and then veganism. But then that also made me reevaluate my humanism and think about how the two need to tie together. And I really could find no justification for ignoring the suffering of any being that suffers.
The term sentientism was already coined in the 70s.
Yeah.
Richard Ryder and Peter Singer, these are the main people that influence you, but it didn't get that much attention then. Why do you think that is?
I think it's an interesting story, and my knowledge of the history will no doubt be corrected by professionals in the field, because I'm very much an amateur. But I think the pattern that happened is many people will be aware of roughly the history of the animal advocacy movement. It has deep history in many cultures around the world, religious and non-religious. But the sort of modern animal advocacy movement developed partly around a group in Oxford in the 1840s and then through the next century. But one of the big markers was when Richard Ryder and then Peter Singer started writing about animal liberation and using sentience as a characteristic to grant moral consideration in the 1970s. And I think the word sentientism was first used actually to criticize Peter Singer and Richard Ryder. So I think there's a chap called John Rodman in 1977 who looked at what Peter Singer had written and said, this is just another form of discrimination. You have racism, you have sexism. This is some form of sentientism. This is a form of discrimination that discriminates against non-sentient beings. So it was actually used in a critical term originally, in a critical way. So I think that's partly why maybe the term didn't take off, because it was seen as a criticism. But Richard and Peter, did use the term, and it has been used since in a positive light to say, absolutely, it is a discrimination. It's morally correct discrimination because it includes every being capable of experiencing suffering. Now, for both Richard and Peter, it was always a naturalistic philosophy, and sometimes they explicitly set it against, religious or supernatural ethics as an alternative. But when they talked about sentientism, the naturalism was fairly narrow. It was just using a scientific approach to assess sentience and then using that to grant moral consideration. So what I've been doing in the last 2 years is really trying to suggest that we recast the word sentientism. So we say, well, sentiocentrism is drawing your moral circle to include all sentient beings, but it doesn't say anything about the supernatural or naturalistic worldviews or religion or how you choose to believe what is true. It just talks about your moral circle. That's sentiocentrism. So let's double down on sentientism being a naturalistic worldview, but not just naturalistic in drawing on that moral circle, naturalistic in all domains. So in that sense, it becomes like an extension of secular humanism that says, we believe purely on naturalistic bases, we reject all supernatural beliefs, and we have a sentiocentric worldview. So if that makes sense. So we're making it more broadly naturalistic across all domains, not just in animal ethics. The second thing I've suggested we do is to keep it as a very basic pluralistic philosophical platform. So it just says naturalism and sentiocentrism, but it's neutral on everything else. So while Peter Singer and Richard Ryder and every other philosopher has gone on to develop more detailed philosophies that might take a utilitarian stance, or might focus more on pain versus pleasure, or might take a deontological approach, or whatever. There's a whole swathe of different philosophical approaches. I'm suggesting we use sentientism to describe just that baseline. So those are the two things I've been trying to do in the last 2 years of projects, just to sort of recast that term and just clarify its definition and build a bit of a movement around it.
Okay, that's really clear. Correct me if I'm not understanding it right, but if the science in a naturalistic sense would say that, already talked a little bit about plants, maybe we could broaden it to whole ecological systems. If the science would tell us that, for instance, plants are sentient as well, we could include them, right? Like for my thesis, I read a lot about including everything that is more than human in our moral circle. For instance, in Anat Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, or Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, even thinking about including bacteria. And we are in a whole meshwork of all these things working together, and we should not be discriminating any of them. When is the science hard enough to say we include something that's very personal, if I understand you correctly, right?
I think it is, because some people will get the impression when we talk about a naturalistic worldview or a scientific worldview that we're saying there is one answer and everybody has to agree with it. And that is very far from what naturalism and what science means. Over time, you would hope that because we do all live in one shared reality, and we do roughly have similar perceptual means, and we can share information, and we reason in roughly the same way, that yes, we might well converge over time. And you could argue that all of human progress has been that process of coming to sort of agree on how things work and what's real, and then working together on that stuff. But it doesn't mean that everybody agrees, right? There's conflicting evidence, there's different qualities of evidence, people reason in different ways. Scientific hypotheses get torn down and built up. It's a continuous, messy and political process of change that just shifts around all the time. So in a way, it does remain a personal choice. But at the same time, I think, personally, I do think there are standards we should apply and level of confidence we should require before we grant credence to things. So I'm very comfortable not knowing something. I'm very comfortable saying, I don't know, and I don't believe that because I haven't seen the evidence yet, and being open to more evidence. But there is a danger that we get so open-minded, we grant credence and we grant belief to things before there is any reasonable supporting evidence to support. And so while I do appreciate this sort of sense of connectedness and holism around extending our moral circle even further than sentience and saying, look, everything's connected, we're all part of a universal whole. I agree with that. I get the same sense of awe and wonder and connectedness from a naturalistic scientific understanding as many people do from a religious understanding. But there are dangers there about how we prioritize. And, an example I would give is, and this will annoy many environmentalists, right? But the center of gravity of environmentalist ethics today has taken a concern about the human race, and because of environmental threats and climate change, it has extended its moral circle to include habitats, environments, species diversity, ecologies, ecosystems, the planet as a whole, a sense of the earth as Gaia, right? And it's extended that moral circle radically in potentially quite a positive way, whilst skipping a layer of all of the sentient non-human animals. So there are environmentalists who are very ready to grant rights to rivers, but will still quite happily eat a bacon sandwich in the morning. And that's where I get a little bit nervous. In a way, I don't mind if you want to extend your moral circle beyond sentient beings to bacteria and plants and to rocks and to rivers and to everything else. But please don't forget the beings that we are very confident are capable of suffering. And too often, the environmental movement starts to do that. I think we need, there's some interesting correctives. You might be interested in looking at Mark Beckhoff's work around compassionate conservationism, which says we need that ecological, environmental conservationism and that mindset, but it has to be compassionate. We have to focus on the experiences of the sentient beings. And in a way, for me, that's the only reason the environment matters. The only reason rocks and rivers and trees and the atmosphere matter is because they're critically interdependencies of sentient beings like us and non-human animals.
Okay, so it would be kind of the first step to see the sentient beings, and then maybe also flowing out from that the broader environmental parts.
Yeah, and wanting to protect the environment in ways that is driven by the experience of sentient beings. And that doesn't mean that we just want the environment to deliver, a technical set of basic ecosystem services to keep us alive, right? That's not what I mean. The environment also has enormous aesthetic power and richness for us. Much of our sentient experiences as humans and as non-humans is based on the aesthetic experience of being in the world and in the environment. That has enormous power and value, but it's instrumental value. It's value because of how we experience it. It's not intrinsically valuable. So I do think it's important to draw that line. And the subject about, the conversation about plants is interesting because, as any vegan on Twitter will know, it's a classic thing for someone who consumes animal products to say is, oh, plants are sentient too. Now, of course, they haven't looked into the science and they don't really care, but their logic is, well, if plants suffer as well, then we might as well eat pigs and cows and chickens and fish. So that's not a serious argument, but there is a serious question about, if sentience is a complex range of information processing, and the more we learn about plants, the more complex their information processing seems to be. Shouldn't we be open-minded? And I would say we absolutely should. And if there's good scientific evidence that demonstrates that plants are sentient, then we should grant them moral consideration. Interestingly, as an aside, if plants are sentient, I'm afraid you still have to be vegan, because farmed animals, roughly, you have to feed them 10 times the calories from plants to get the calories from meat, milk and dairy and eggs as you would if you just ate the plants directly. So if plants do turn out to be sentient, there's still no escape, because to save the plants, we'd still need to eat them directly instead of feeding 10 times as many to farmed animals. So
yeah,
it doesn't even work as an anti-vegan argument on Twitter, I'm afraid.
No, that's the important part where the reason gets into work. We can't forget about that now. I think it's very just being compassionate for sentient beings and not for everything. Plants we just talked about makes it maybe more concrete, but it is still a very large worldview. It's a kind of ethical principle. And I read a lot about on sentientism.info about the concrete applications of the philosophy that are going on now. Talk about the sentientist language, or the what I find really interesting, the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. Yeah, could you elaborate a bit on how these things go into practice, if sentientism is already picked up by other scientific disciplines and or even maybe in art? How big is this movement at the moment?
Yeah, so it's, as you said, it's very simple, it's very broad, and it can seem quite generic. It can almost seem hard to disagree with, right? Who would disagree with evidence and reason, and who would disagree with having compassion for all beings that can suffer? I agree, right? Most people on the planet disagree because they have a supernatural stance and they believe in things for which I think there's no evidence, or because they have restricted circles of compassion that do exclude some groups of humans and some groups of non-human sentient beings as well. So it does have direct implications. Those can run through personal behaviors and decisions. Those can run through institutional policies and corporate decisions. Those can run through declarations of rights and law. Those can influence the Sustainable Development Goals. In practical terms, it's an interesting thought experiment to find the word human and replace it with sentient being in every one of our important policies and documents and see what it does. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? There are some types of sentient being who have very different capabilities from animals, so it doesn't make sense to grant them certain rights that only make sense for humans. But you'd be amazed at how many things it works on, because the most important needs and interests and rights that we have as humans actually are the ones that we share with other sentient beings as well. The rights to continue to live, the rights to avoid physical harm, the rights for security and safety and freedom. These are all things that all sentient beings, have interest in and want and need. The more esoteric things, some of those might just be specific to humans as well. So I think we can make enormous progress by just extending that moral circle and applying that in every instance. To flip that the other way around, it's also interesting for people to think about the way they think about their animal ethics and think, does that work if I apply it to humans? And if it doesn't, for example, if you're against the farming of human toddlers for food, maybe you need to think again. So that's a broad, generic, suggestion that we need to extend our moral circle and apply that to almost every aspect of our lives, institutionally and personally. But the naturalism also has an implication as well, because sentientism doesn't suggest that we shouldn't have freedom of belief. I think all sentientists, because of their compassion for people who have religious or supernatural beliefs, would actually support a practical secularism, which means you can believe absolutely anything you like. It can be as crazy as you want, but because of passion for other sentient beings, you cannot use that supernatural belief to justify needlessly harming or killing other sentient beings. So in the same way as we start from freedom of speech, we start from an ethos of freedom in human liberalism, but then you put boundaries around that and you put laws or rights or protections in place to stop people's beliefs causing harm. You do the same in a naturalistic context, in a secularist context, around religious or supernatural worldviews that can cause harm as well. So yeah, in practical terms, if the world became sentientist overnight, there would be no animal farming, which may seem radical, but you can't justify doing it for humans, and there is no justification for doing it for other sentient beings either. There would be no religiously motivated harms, so cruel and unusual punishments, infant genital mutilation. The list goes on. That they're not things you could substantiate because you couldn't use a supernatural rationale to justify needlessly causing harm. But it reaches beyond religion as well. I think you also see other forms of belief that aren't founded on evidence and reason. Where they cause harm, you'd see those fade away as well. So whether that's alternative medicine or most of the wellness industry, or Ponzi schemes, or or nationalistic, autocratic, fascistic government models, those are non-religious, but they still put some form of superior authority as more important than the suffering or the experience of sentient beings. So I won't ramble on too much, but yeah, I mean, it potentially has very deep, broad implications. But the outcome, I think, would be, a better world where there is less suffering and more flourishing for all sentient beings on the planet and maybe beyond.
I'm thinking at the moment that suffering, it seems as if the main description of it would be physical suffering, because the main attention seems to lie on animals, and that we should broaden them or broaden our moral circle and keep them in there as well. But yeah, how can I say this? In a future of sentientism, there would disappear a lot of harmful conservative religious and cultural traditions, like the ones we socialize with, and we get to think that hurting animals is all right. But if we have compassion with people with these religious traditions, and at the same time we tell them you can't do this anymore, aren't we going to make them suffer as well? Not physically,
Yes.
but like in their beliefs and in their. I think it's a.
We are.
Yeah.
And I think again, this is one of the points where sentientism is, irritatingly neutral. Is there are some, I think, really obvious situations like animal farming where the ethical situation is so clear, it's essentially a win-win, because ending animal farming will be great for humans too. But then, as you say, there are situations where interests compete, right? So where someone might want to do something that causes harm to somebody else, and preventing them from doing that causes harm to that individual as well. And you get into all of the usual fields of morality and ethics about the different ways of how to balance off those different interests. But in simple terms, my personal view would be, if the harm that's being caused is, if you like, lower down Maslow's hierarchy, right? It's a physical harm. It's a harm that can't be reversed. It's something that causes serious unpleasantness in the experience of that being. But the harm you're caused by preventing someone doing that is one that just resists a supernaturally motivated preference. For me, that's quite an easy choice, particularly when you think about the autonomy of the individual who's under that oppressive stance, right? So, but you're absolutely right to point out that, as with any law, constraining people, even if it's for a very good reason, does harm the preferences of the people you're trying to constrain. So there are many difficult trade-offs there. But what I think you'll find is many of the most important ones are actually really, really obvious when you work the ethics through from a basic standpoint. There are complex, difficult problems, but then there are some that are really, really clear. And I'd apply that same logic to animal farming, right? Someone will say, you're harming me because I really enjoy the taste of bacon. And I will say, well, yes, we are, right? But when you lay that against the interest and the experience of the sentient being that is harmed and killed to give you that pleasure, it's a really easy ethical trade-off. So I'm sorry, you're just going to have to suck it up. And by the way, we've also got some increasingly brilliant alternatives that will give you a wonderful taste and texture sensation that mean you don't need to cause harm anyway. And the only thing that clouds our thinking is really social norms and traditions and cultures that have taught us, often from birth, that these things are normal things to do. And when you take the scales away from your eyes and just think about suffering, flourishing, life and death, let's balance the interests out, the answer is often painfully obvious.
Yeah, and I think these extreme things need to be pointed out to get people to see that how they are socialized is very wrong often.
You'll be amazed, and I know it's only Twitter, but you'll be amazed the weird ethical stances people will be willing to adopt to justify their traditional practices. Even in the last week, I've had people say, yes, I would ethically support the farming of human toddlers for food, believe it or not.
Wow.
I've had people proudly proclaim their racism, their sexism, and their homophobia because they have a personal experience with a God that told them, that was the right answer. I mean, the list goes on, right? And these aren't isolated incidents. These, in many instances, are the dominant ethics of humans around the world today.
But I think it's very interesting that, you see how these things get normalized, and that this is exactly the point where we can do something.
But I also think there's real value in just upgrading the baseline of human ethics in general, because there's so much uncertainty about the world, a lot of moral uncertainty as well. There's been some fascinating books and papers written on those topics recently by people like Will MacAskill and Toby Ord and others. it can be bewildering to work out what's the best impact you can have on the world. But one thing I think I'm very confident about is if we can upgrade the baseline of human ethics generally, across 8 billion people on the planet, to where we all have a commitment to evidence and reason and a naturalistic way of thinking, and we all have a universal compassion for all sentient beings so that no suffering being is excluded. While that might seem a little generic and it might seem a bit philosophical and a bit vague, every single person who adopts that philosophy improves the decisions they take for the rest of their lives. So I think while it might have a background second order effect, I think maybe it can have a really deep foundational fundamental positive effect on all of those different rainbow of different initiatives and practical changes we need to make in the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I have to say, on the first time I viewed the website, there was a lot stated about what will change in the future if sentientism will grow, what will and I almost get like the creepy feeling of a utopia, because it sounded too good, and I thought like, okay, we can't not suffer anymore, or there will always be suffering.
Yes.
Like Morton talks about the rabbit and the rabbit hunter. We can't have compassion for both of them. Yeah, as you talk about it now, I understand more and more that it's just this ethical principle that everything subsequently can flow out of, and we have to talk with each other about how we can implement this.
And I think it's so important that we don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Many people have said that, right? So one argument can be, your naturalism isn't perfectly confident of all knowledge, so I reject it. It's like, we never pretended to be perfectly confident. That's the point of a scientific worldview, is you're always uncertain, you're always open, you're always not quite sure. That's the power of it. That's the value of it. So, you can criticize it for being perfect, but that's the power. It's not supposed to be perfect. And it's the same front, right? It's inconceivable that there would be some perfect future state where there's zero suffering and we all exist in gradients of hedonic bliss, as some of my transhumanist sentientist friends would talk about. Maybe one day you could imagine getting there, right? But the fact that that's hard, or that the goal feels difficult, doesn't mean you shouldn't try and make things better, right? That's no excuse for just trying to reduce the suffering you cause. And it's, you see that in the veganist movement as well. Part of the problem with many preachy vegans, and I often am one, is that it comes across as, we're morally perfect, and that's bullshit, right? Arable farming causes sentient beings to suffer and die as well through use of pesticides and harvesting. Almost everything we do in the modern world does cause some suffering, but that doesn't mean we should give up. It just means we should try to do better and try and reduce the suffering we cause.
Yeah,
and yeah, it does sound a bit naive and utopian, but I don't see why not. Why not?
Yeah, and utopia is something that we can mirror ourselves on, and in that way we can grow into something more compassionate, I think.
And we probably will never get there, but we could keep moving towards it. And I would say, despite all of the challenges and the horrors we see around us today, we should have heart that we have made progress, right? We have so much more to do, and progress can reverse too. But if you look back over the centuries and even the decades, this type of thinking, whether it's naturalistic thinking or humanistic thinking or now sentientist thinking, can make real change and real progress. So we should keep going, right? It's not a time to give up. We've got so much more to do.
For listeners at home, if they are interested and want to talk about this with other people or with you, there's this whole online community growing around sentientism at the moment. As you talked about the Facebook wall, people can join the group. We will post all links underneath. Are there certain books or people to follow, or documentaries that you would recommend to the listeners at home who would want to deepen their knowledge? I
would certainly talk about Peter Singer and Richard Ryder, who developed the term in the first place, and they've been very kind and helpful to me in this sort of recasting I'm trying to do now. I guess all stances that take a naturalistic approach to ethics. One interesting example of an explanation of that is a book called The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris, who tries to lay out an approach which starts from a purely naturalistic view and then builds on that. I would also, we have a subreddit for sentientism as well, and there's an enormous range of different resources there that focus on either naturalistic ethics They focus on the science of sentience and consciousness, which is fascinating in its own right, and of course the entire field of Mark Bekoff's compassionate conservationism and animal ethics and animal advocacy. So so many different avenues to follow that flow from this very simple worldview.
Yeah.
But there's some suggestions.
Yeah, if you just type in the word sentientism, a lot of things and conversations will appear. And I think there are already, as you talked about, so many people who actually already feel this way, but don't know that there is a term for this already. And let's keep in dialogue, think together. Let's not sit still with our normalizations. Yeah, and I think you are doing such great work. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. And I would say that, I was hesitant about, we've got enough isms in the world already. And I'm very keen that sentientism isn't seen as like another divisive ism in this. So all of our groups, whether it's on Facebook or Discord or Telegram or LinkedIn, are open to anyone who's interested in the idea. You don't have to be a sentientist.
Yeah, and it's always with everything that tries to be universal. It has to be careful that it's not oppressing or
Yeah, and I have to remind myself and many others that it's very easy to have compassion for people you agree with. The challenge is you also have to have compassion for the people you disagree with. Well, I fail at that myself daily, but we have to remind ourselves.
Such an inspiring and important worldview, I think. Let's strive for a more compassionate world, Jamie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be your guest today, and thank you for helping me reach another audience. I'd love to hear what people think of the ideas.
Thank you so much.
Great, a real pleasure. Bye everyone.
For more information, links and show notes, please visit futurebased.org.